The Harvard Law School auditorium was packed to capacity on this crisp November evening, with every seat filled and students lining the walls, their phones already recording what they expected to be just another distinguished lecture from Professor Alan Dershowitz. The legendary attorney stood at the podium, his white hair perfectly combed, his dark suit immaculate, his presence commanding, as he prepared to deliver his lecture on constitutional law and civil liberties. At 75 years old, Dershowitz carried himself with the confidence of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court, defended presidents and celebrities, and written dozens of books that sat on law school shelves across the nation. The audience settled into respectful silence as he began his presentation, clicking through slides that highlighted his most famous cases and legal theories. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these explosive political confrontations that are shaping America today. But in the third row, Representative Jasmine Crockett sat with her arms crossed, her dark blazer pressed and professional, her expression growing more troubled with each passing minute. The 43-year-old congresswoman from Texas had come to Harvard, not as a casual observer, but with a specific purpose. In her briefcase lay a folder thick with documents, research papers, and highlighted passages that told a very different story from the one Dershowitz was presenting to this room full of impressionable law students. Crockett, herself a civil rights attorney before entering Congress, had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously reviewing Dershowitz's published work, and what she had found disturbed her deeply. The errors were not minor footnotes or debatable interpretations, they were fundamental misrepresentations of legal precedent, selective quotations that changed the meaning of Supreme Court decisions, and arguments built on factual foundations that simply did not exist. Dershowitz continued his lecture, his voice rising with passion as he described his role in several high-profile cases. He spoke about defending constitutional principles, about standing up for civil liberties even when unpopular, about his commitment to the law above all else. The students nodded along, some taking notes, others simply watching in admiration. This was Harvard law, and they were in the presence of what many considered legal royalty. His books lined their shelves, his cases filled their textbooks, and his reputation preceded him into every room he entered. The power dynamic was clear. Dershowitz was the established authority, the professor emeritus, the man who had shaped legal thinking for generations. But Crockett saw something else. She saw a man who had become so comfortable in his authority that he no longer felt the need to be careful with facts. She saw someone who wielded his reputation as a shield against scrutiny, assuming that his name alone would validate whatever claims he made. And she saw students who were being taught legal principles based on flawed scholarship, errors that would carry forward into their own practices and perpetuate misunderstandings of the law. As Dershowitz moved into the question and answer portion of his lecture, Crockett raised her hand. The moderator, a senior faculty member who had introduced Dershowitz with glowing praise, looked surprised to see a member of Congress in the audience, but quickly called on her. Crockett stood slowly, her briefcase in hand, and the room's energy shifted immediately. Students who had been relaxed in their seats straightened up, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. Dershowitz smiled pleasantly, clearly not recognizing her at first, expecting perhaps a softball question or a chance for more self-promotion. But then Crockett identified herself. Professor Dershowitz, I'm Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas, and I'm also a civil rights attorney. I've spent the last 3 weeks carefully reviewing your published work, particularly your recent book on constitutional law and your articles on civil liberties. Her voice was calm, professional, almost gentle, but there was an unmistakable firmness beneath it. And I need to tell you, and more importantly, I need to tell these students that I found numerous serious errors in your scholarship that cannot go unchallenged. The auditorium erupted in whispers. Students exchanged shocked glances. Faculty members leaned forward in their seats. Someone in the back row gasped audibly. This was Harvard Law School, where challenging a professor emeritus, especially one of Dershowitz's stature, was simply not done. The moderator looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene. Dershowitz's smile faded, replaced by a look of surprise mixed with irritation. He clearly had not expected this evening to take this turn. His hand gripped the podium slightly tighter as he responded with forced politeness. Representative Crockett, I'm always happy to engage in scholarly debate, but perhaps you'd like to schedule a private meeting to discuss your concerns rather than making accusations in a public forum. Crockett didn't move, didn't sit down, didn't back away from the moment. Her response came quickly and firmly. With respect, Professor, these students deserve to hear this in the same public forum where you've presented your work. You've just spent an hour teaching them legal principles based on scholarship that contains fundamental errors. They have a right to know. She opened her briefcase and pulled out the thick folder, holding it up so the room could see. I have documented 23 separate instances in your recent publications where you have misrepresented Supreme Court decisions, taken quotations out of context to reverse their meaning, or built arguments on factual claims that are demonstrably false. These aren't matters of interpretation or scholarly disagreement. These are errors that any first-year law student should catch, and frankly that you as a Harvard professor absolutely should not be making. The whispers in the auditorium grew louder. Students were now openly talking to each other, their phones out and recording. This was no longer a standard lecture. This had become something else entirely, a confrontation that would dominate law school discussions for weeks and likely make national news before the night was over. The moderator tried to regain control. Representative Crockett, perhaps we should allow Professor Dershowitz to respond and then move on to other questions. But Crockett was not finished. She had come prepared for exactly this moment, knowing that Dershowitz would try to dismiss her, that the institutional weight of Harvard would try to protect one of its most famous faculty members, that she would need overwhelming evidence to make her case stick. Before we move on, let me give you a specific example. In your book, you claim that the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education was primarily influenced by social science research presented in the case. You build an entire chapter around this premise. But that's not accurate. The court's decision was based fundamentally on constitutional principle, on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Yes, the famous footnote 11 references social science research, but Chief Justice Warren and the other justices made it clear in their deliberations, which are now part of the historical record, that they would have reached the same conclusion based purely on constitutional grounds. By misrepresenting this, you're teaching these students a distorted view of one of the most important civil rights decisions in American history. She paused, letting the words sink in, then continued, and that's just one example. In your recent article on executive power, you quote from United States versus Nixon to support your argument about presidential immunity. But the quotation you use is incomplete. You leave out the crucial second half of the sentence that completely reverses the meaning. The full quote actually contradicts your argument. That's not scholarship, Professor Dershowitz. That's manipulation. Dershowitz's face had turned red. His hands gripped the podium tightly as he struggled to maintain his composure. The students were riveted, some looking at Crockett with something like awe, others glancing at Dershowitz with newly skeptical eyes. The power dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. The authority figure was now on the defensive, and the challenger had the evidence. Representative Crockett, Dershowitz began, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I have been teaching constitutional law for over 50 years. I have argued before the Supreme Court. I have written books that are used in law schools around the world. I think I know something about legal scholarship. This attempt to embarrass me in front of my students is unprofessional and frankly beneath someone who holds public office. You're making allegations without giving me a fair chance to respond to specific claims. But Crockett was ready for this too. She had anticipated every defense, every deflection, every attempt to turn this into a question of respect for authority rather than accuracy of facts. I'm not trying to embarrass you, Professor. I'm trying to correct the record before these students build their understanding of constitutional law on a flawed foundation. And as for giving you a chance to respond, I actually reached out to your office 3 times over the past 2 weeks to request a meeting to discuss these errors privately. I received no response, or I sent a detailed letter outlining my concerns. No response. I even tried to contact you through the Harvard Law Administration. Nothing. So please don't suggest that I haven't given you fair notice or opportunity to address these issues privately. The room went completely silent. This new information changed the narrative entirely. Crockett hadn't ambushed Dershowitz. She had tried to handle this discreetly, professionally, through proper channels. He had ignored her. Now she had no choice but to make it public. A student in the front row, a young woman with her laptop open, raised her hand tentatively. The moderator, clearly lost in how to manage this situation, nodded at her. The student's voice was nervous but determined. Representative Crockett, do you have those documents with you? Could you show us the specific examples you're talking about? I think a lot of us would like to see the evidence. Crockett nodded. I do. I have copies for anyone who wants them. But let me show you the most egregious example right now. She pulled out several pages and held up the first one. This is a page from Professor Dershowitz's book, Chapter 7, where he discusses the limits of presidential power. Now look at this. She held up a second page. This is the actual Supreme Court decision he's citing. I've highlighted the passage he quotes. You can see where his quotation stops. Now look at the next sentence, the one he doesn't include. It completely contradicts his argument. He cherry-picked the quotation to support his position, leaving out the part that would undermine it. She walked toward the front row and handed the pages to the students there. Pass these around, everyone should see this. The students began circulating the documents, and as they read, their expressions changed. Some looked shocked, others looked angry. A few looked at Dershowitz with what could only be described as betrayal. These were students who had paid enormous tuition to learn from the best, who trusted that their professors would teach them with integrity and accuracy. Dershowitz tried to recover. He cleared his throat and spoke with renewed confidence, as if he could talk his way through this by sheer force of authority. Let me explain something about legal scholarship that perhaps Representative Crockett, who spent most of her career in trial law rather than academic work, might not fully understand. When we write for a general audience, we sometimes simplify complex legal arguments. We can't include every nuance, every caveat, every conflicting interpretation. That doesn't make it wrong. It makes it accessible. The Supreme Court cases I cite support the general principles I'm discussing, even if individual sentences might be subject to different interpretations. But Crockett wasn't buying it, and increasingly neither were the students. She responded immediately, her voice cutting through his explanation. Professor, this isn't about simplification or accessibility. This is about accuracy. You can make complex legal arguments accessible without being misleading, and you certainly can't quote sources in a way that reverses their meaning. That's not simplification. That's misrepresentation. She turned to address the students directly. When you go into practice, if you cite a case this way in a brief, you could face sanctions. If you do it in front of a judge, you could be held in contempt. Academic freedom doesn't mean freedom to be inaccurate, and your reputation, no matter how distinguished, doesn't excuse you from basic scholarly standards. Another student raised their hand, this time a young man near the back. Professor Dershowitz, I have your book here. I'm looking at the section Representative Crockett mentioned. I have to say she's right. The quotation is incomplete, and the part that's left out does seem to contradict your argument. Can you explain that? The question came from one of his own students, someone who had presumably admired him enough to buy his book and attend his lecture. The crack in Dershowitz's armour was growing wider. He tried to answer, stumbling slightly over his words. I'd have to review the specific passage in context. I've written thousands of pages over my career. I can't be expected to remember every quotation in every book. Crockett seized on this. But that's exactly the problem, Professor. You can't remember because there are too many errors to keep track of. This isn't one mistake. It's a pattern. And it's a pattern that suggests either carelessness or worse, a deliberate attempt to manipulate sources to fit predetermined conclusions. She pulled out another document. Let me give you another example. In your article on First Amendment protections, you claim that the Supreme Court has consistently held that hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. That's partially true, but you fail to mention the crucial exceptions the court has carved out. Fighting words, true threats, incitement to imminent lawless action. By presenting the issue as absolute, you're giving these students an incomplete and potentially dangerous understanding of First Amendment law. The moderator tried again to intervene. I think we're running out of time and should perhaps wrap this up, but the students were not ready to wrap anything up. Multiple hands shot up round the room. The moderator looked helplessly at Dershowitz, who nodded grimly. A young woman in the middle of the auditorium stood up. I'm a second-year student and I cited Professor Dershowitz's work in a paper last semester. If what Representative Crockett is saying is true, does that mean my paper was wrong? Do I need to go back and correct it? Crockett's expression softened as she looked at the student. I would encourage you to go back to the primary sources. Don't rely on secondary scholarship, no matter how prestigious the author. Always check the cases yourself. That's true whether you're reading Professor Dershowitz's work or mine or anyone else's. Good legal practice means doing your own research. Dershowitz saw an opening and tried to use it. That's exactly right. Students should always go to the primary sources. That's what I teach. So I'm glad Representative Crockett agrees with me on that point, even if she disagrees with my interpretations of those sources. But Crockett shook her head. No, Professor, we're not talking about interpretations. We're talking about accurate representation of what the sources actually say. You can interpret Brown versus Board of Education in different ways. You can have scholarly debates about its implications. But you cannot misrepresent the factual basis of the court's decision. You cannot leave out half of a quotation and pretend the source supports your argument when it actually contradicts it. Those aren't interpretive differences, those are errors. The tension in the room was now palpable. Students were whispering intensely to each other. Some were typing furiously on their laptops, presumably researching Crockett's claims in real time. Others were taking pictures of the documents she had distributed. The moderator looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between protecting a distinguished faculty member and acknowledging that serious concerns had been raised. Faculty members in the audience were exchanging worried glances, realizing that this confrontation could have implications far beyond this one evening. If Crockett was right, and it was becoming increasingly clear that she was, then Harvard Law School had a problem. One of its most famous professors had published scholarship with significant errors, and students had been learning from flawed materials. A distinguished-looking older man in the audience stood up, identifying himself as a member of the Harvard Law faculty. Representative Crockett, Professor Dershowitz, I think we need to take these concerns seriously. If there are indeed errors in published scholarship, the academic community has a responsibility to address them. Perhaps we should convene a formal review. Dershowitz's expression darkened further. He clearly had not expected one of his colleagues to side with Crockett. A formal review based on accusations made in a public ambush. I have devoted my entire career to legal scholarship and education. My work has been peer-reviewed and published by prestigious academic presses. One person's disagreement, even if that person is a member of Congress, doesn't constitute grounds for a formal review. But Crockett had an answer for this too. Professor, I'm not one person. I'm one person who has taken the time to document the problems publicly. But I'm willing to bet I'm not the only one who has noticed these issues. She addressed the room at large. How many of you, as you've read Professor Dershowitz's work, have had moments where something didn't quite add up, where a citation seemed off or an argument seemed to skip over important contrary evidence? How many of you have had those moments but didn't say anything because you assumed you must be wrong, because surely a Harvard professor couldn't make such basic mistakes? Several hands slowly went up around the room, then a few more, then more still. Within moments, nearly a third of the students in the auditorium had their hands raised. The expression on Dershowitz's face was one of genuine shock. A student near the front spoke up without being called on. I noticed something weird in the section on executive privilege. The case you cited seemed to say the opposite of what you claimed it said, but I figured I must have misunderstood it. Another student chimed in. Same thing happened to me with the Fourth Amendment section. I spent hours trying to understand how the case supported your argument, and I finally just gave up and assumed I wasn't smart enough to get it. The room was experiencing a collective realization. These students, these bright and dedicated future lawyers, had noticed problems but had dismissed their own observations, assuming that their confusion was their own fault rather than considering that the celebrated professor might be wrong. Crockett's voice was gentle but firm as she addressed the students. Don't ever assume you're wrong just because someone has more credentials than you do. Trust your own reading. Trust your own analysis. If something doesn't make sense, it might be because it doesn't make sense, not because you're not understanding it. That's a lesson that goes way beyond this particular situation. That's a lesson that will serve you throughout your careers, she turned back to Dershowitz. And Professor, that's why this matters so much. You're not just publishing scholarship that other academics will read and critique. You're teaching the next generation of lawyers. These students trust you. They assume that what you're teaching them is accurate. When you make errors, especially errors that are this fundamental and this numerous, you're not just damaging your own reputation, you're undermining their education. Dershowitz stood silently for a long moment. The fight seemed to be draining out of him as he looked around the room at the raised hands at the students, studying the documents Crockett had distributed at his colleagues' uncomfortable expressions. Finally he spoke, and his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Representative Crockett, you've made your point. I will review the specific examples you've raised. If there are errors, I will correct them in future editions. But I want to be clear that any errors were inadvertent, not intentional. I have never deliberately misrepresented sources. Crockett nodded. I appreciate that acknowledgement, Professor, but I think inadvertent errors on this scale suggest a lack of rigour in your research and review process. And I hope the corrections won't just be in future editions. I hope you'll issue public corrections now so that everyone who has already purchased these books knows about the errors. The moderator, seizing what seemed like a natural ending point, stood up. I think this has been a very enlightening discussion, though perhaps not the discussion we expected this evening. I want to thank both Representative Crockett and Professor Dershowitz for their engagement. We will certainly follow up on these concerns through appropriate channels. The auditorium began to empty slowly, students clustering in small groups, talking intensely. Many approached Crockett, thanking her for speaking up, asking for copies of her research. A few approached Dershowitz, though notably fewer than would typically surround him after a lecture. Faculty members gathered in their own group, clearly discussing what had just happened and what it meant for the law school. As Crockett packed up her briefcase, the student who had first asked to see her documents approached. Representative Crockett, thank you for this. I mean it. We need people who are willing to challenge authority when authority is wrong. Too much of legal education is about deference to big names and prestigious institutions. What you did tonight reminded us that the law should be about truth and accuracy, not about reputation. Crockett smiled warmly. That means a lot. And remember that lesson when you're practicing. Don't be intimidated by opposing counsel's credentials or experience. Focus on the facts, focus on the law, and trust your own preparation and analysis. The next morning, the Harvard Law School campus was buzzing with discussion about the previous evening's confrontation. By breakfast time, videos of the exchange had spread across social media. Legal Twitter, as the community of lawyers and law students on the platform was known, was exploding with commentary. Some defended Dershowitz, arguing that Crockett had been disrespectful and that errors in scholarship were normal and didn't justify a public confrontation. But many more, including numerous legal scholars and practicing attorneys, praised Crockett for holding a prominent figure accountable and for standing up for academic integrity. The hashtag Harvard Alumni Furious began trending as graduates of the law school expressed their dismay that such significant errors had gone unnoticed and unchallenged for so long. Within days, several other legal scholars published their own analyses of Dershowitz's work, confirming many of Crockett's findings and identifying additional problems. A group of Harvard Law alumni, many of them accomplished lawyers and judges themselves, wrote an open letter to the law school administration demanding a comprehensive review of all of Dershowitz's publications and calling for reforms in how the school oversees faculty scholarship. The letter noted that while academic freedom was essential and must be protected, it did not extend to factual inaccuracy or misrepresentation of sources. The alumni emphasized that Harvard's reputation, and by extension their own degrees, depended on the integrity of the institution's scholarship. The publisher of Dershowitz's most recent book, responding to the growing controversy, announced that they were temporarily suspending sales while they conducted their own review of the manuscript. They promised that if errors were confirmed, they would issue corrected versions and notify all purchasers. Other publishers who had released Dershowitz's earlier works began their own reviews. The academic community, which had long treated Dershowitz as an untouchable figure due to his fame and longevity, was being forced to reckon with the possibility that reputation alone could not excuse sloppy scholarship. The conservative media predictably attempted to frame the story as an attack on a defender of conservative positions. Several commentators suggested that Crockett, a Democratic congresswoman, had political motivations for challenging Dershowitz, but this narrative struggled to gain traction because Crockett's critique was not ideological. She had not challenged Dershowitz's political positions or policy arguments. She had challenged his accuracy in representing legal sources, something that transcended political divisions. Even conservative legal scholars, while some defended Dershowitz personally, were forced to acknowledge that if the errors were as Crockett documented, they were serious problems regardless of anyone's political views. Legal blogs and journals published extensive discussions of the controversy, with many using it as an opportunity to discuss broader questions about legal scholarship, academic accountability, and the role of reputation in the legal academy. Several prominent law professors wrote articles arguing that the Dershowitz controversy exposed systemic problems in how legal scholarship was reviewed and published. Too often, they argued, big-name authors received less rigorous peer review because publishers and editors assumed their work would be sound. The presumption of correctness that came with prestige meant that errors could persist and proliferate, being cited by other scholars who trusted the original author's reputation rather than checking the sources themselves. Crockett herself became something of a hero to many law students and young lawyers, particularly women and people of colour who had often felt intimidated by the white male-dominated hierarchy of the legal academy. She had demonstrated that it was possible to challenge even the most established figures if you did your homework, prepared your evidence, and spoke with confidence backed by facts. Her office was flooded with messages from law students thanking her for speaking up, and from practicing attorneys sharing their own stories of times they had noticed problems in legal scholarship but had been too intimidated to say anything. The incident had sparked a broader conversation about who gets to be an authority in legal matters and how that authority should be questioned when it proves unreliable. Harvard Law School eventually released a statement acknowledging that concerns had been raised about errors in faculty scholarship and promising a thorough review process. The statement carefully avoided naming Dershowitz specifically and emphasized the school's commitment to both academic freedom and academic integrity. It noted that all scholars, regardless of their experience or reputation, were expected to meet high standards of accuracy and intellectual honesty. The statement was widely seen as a diplomatic attempt to address the controversy without fully admitting the extent of the problem, but it was nonetheless significant that the institution felt compelled to respond at all. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Dershowitz published a lengthy statement on his website. He acknowledged that errors had been identified in some of his recent publications and took responsibility for not being as careful as he should have been in checking sources and quotations. He attributed some of the problems to the fact that he had been working with research assistants who had made mistakes that he had failed to catch. He promised that future editions of his books would be corrected and that he would be more diligent in his review process going forward. Notably, while he apologised for the errors, he did not apologise to Crockett for his initial dismissive response to her concerns, or for ignoring her attempts to contact him privately before going public. Crockett responded with a statement of her own, expressing satisfaction that the errors were being acknowledged and corrected, but noting that the broader issue was not just about one person's mistakes. She called for reforms in academic publishing that would include more rigorous peer review, particularly for books aimed at students and practitioners who might rely on them as authoritative sources. She also called on law schools to do more to teach students to question authority and to develop the confidence to trust their own analysis, even when it contradicts what established scholars claim. The statement reinforced her position as someone who was using this incident to push for systemic improvements, rather than simply scoring points against a political or ideological opponent. The long-term impact of the confrontation extended far beyond the immediate controversy. Law schools around the country began reviewing their own curricula and the materials they assigned to ensure that students were being taught to engage critically with all scholarship, including that produced by prestigious authors. Several schools implemented new requirements that faculty teaching with their own books or articles must also assign critical responses and alternative viewpoints. The Association of American Law Schools formed a committee to develop best practices for legal scholarship and peer review, with particular attention to preventing the kinds of errors that had been identified in Dershowitz's work. For Dershowitz personally, the incident represented a significant blow to his reputation, though not a fatal one. He continued to teach, write, and make media appearances, but his work was now scrutinized much more carefully, and his claims were no longer accepted on the basis of his reputation alone. Some saw this as a tragic fall for a once great legal mind. Others saw it as a necessary correction, a reminder that no one, regardless of their achievements, should be above accountability. The incident became a case study used in legal ethics courses and in discussions of scholarly integrity, a reminder of what happens when reputation insulates someone from appropriate scrutiny for too long. Crockett returned to Washington and to her work in Congress with her reputation enhanced. She was increasingly sought out for her legal expertise and her willingness to speak truth to power. The incident at Harvard became a defining moment in her public profile, demonstrating that she was not someone who would be intimidated by credentials or institutions, and that she would hold powerful people accountable when they failed to meet appropriate standards. For many young people entering the legal profession, she represented a new model of what leadership could look like, someone who combined substantive expertise with the courage to challenge established hierarchies when those hierarchies protected mediocrity or error. The students who were in that auditorium on the evening of the confrontation found themselves at the center of discussions about legal education for months afterward. Many of them gave interviews or wrote articles about their experience, describing how eye-opening it was to see someone challenge a figure they had been taught to revere and to realize that their own doubts about his work had been justified. Several of them credited the incident with teaching them one of the most important lessons of their legal education, that critical thinking means being willing to question anyone, and that the quality of an argument matters more than the reputation of the person making it. These students would carry that lesson with them into their careers, and some of them would become the next generation of scholars and practitioners who would help ensure that the legal profession held itself to higher standards of accuracy and integrity. The story of Jasmine Crockett confronting Alan Dershowitz at Harvard Law School became more than just a viral moment or a social media controversy. It became a symbol of necessary change in how the legal profession thinks about authority, expertise, and accountability. It reminded everyone that credentials and reputation, while they may be earned through genuine achievement, do not give anyone a permanent pass from scrutiny or a license to be careless with facts. It demonstrated that progress often requires someone to be willing to speak up when they see something wrong, even when doing so is uncomfortable or when it risks backlash from powerful institutions. And it showed that when someone does speak up with evidence and preparation, even the most established authorities can be held accountable, and that accountability can lead to improvements that benefit everyone. In the months that followed, the Legal Academy continued to grapple with the questions the incident raised. Was there too much deference to senior scholars? Were young academics and students discouraged from questioning established figures? How could the field ensure that scholarship was accurate without stifling innovation or debate? These were difficult questions without easy answers, but the fact that they were being asked represented progress. The incident had forced a reckoning with complacency and had reminded everyone in the legal profession that their first loyalty had to be to accuracy and truth, not to reputation or institutional prestige. For anyone watching the story unfold, whether they were law students, practicing attorneys, academics, or simply interested citizens, the lessons were clear and applicable far beyond the narrow world of legal scholarship. Question authority when you have reason to doubt it. Do your own research and trust your own analysis. Prepare thoroughly before you speak up, but do speak up when something is wrong. Don't let credentials or reputation intimidate you into silence when you have evidence on your side. And perhaps most importantly, understand that holding powerful people accountable is not disrespectful or inappropriate, but is actually one of the most important ways we ensure that institutions and professions maintain their integrity and serve the public good. The confrontation between Crockett and Dershowitz also highlighted the importance of persistence in the face of being ignored or dismissed. Crockett had tried 3 times to address the issues privately before going public. She had followed proper channels and given Dershowitz every opportunity to respond to her concerns discreetly. Only when those attempts were rebuffed did she take the step of raising the issues in a public forum. This sequence of events was crucial to her credibility and to the broader reception of her critique. She could not be accused of seeking publicity or of ambushing Dershowitz without warning. She had done everything right, and only then, when left with no alternative, had she chosen to make the matter public. This story also served as a reminder of why diversity in the legal profession and in academia matters. Crockett brought a different perspective as a black woman, as a former civil rights attorney, and as someone whose background gave her reason to be particularly attuned to how constitutional law and civil liberties issues affected marginalized communities. She was more likely to notice when scholarship about civil rights cases was inaccurate because those cases mattered deeply to her and to the communities she had served. A more homogeneous legal academy might have let these errors persist indefinitely because the people with the most authority to challenge them had less personal stake in getting the details right. Diversity of perspective is not just about fairness or representation, though those are important. It is also about ensuring that all viewpoints are rigorously examined and that errors are caught before they become entrenched. The incident became a teaching moment not just for law students, but for anyone in any profession who has ever felt that something was wrong, but was afraid to speak up because of power dynamics or fear of reprisal. Crockett demonstrated that it was possible to challenge authority respectfully but firmly, that evidence and preparation could overcome disparities in status and institutional power, and that speaking truth could lead to positive change even when the initial reaction was defensive or hostile. These lessons resonated far beyond Harvard Law School and the legal profession, inspiring people in many fields to find their own voices and to hold their own institutions and leaders accountable when accountability was needed. As the story continued to be discussed and analysed in the weeks and months after the confrontation, certain themes kept emerging. The importance of intellectual humility, the danger of allowing reputation to substitute for rigour, the necessity of creating spaces where challenge and critique are welcomed rather than punished, the value of teaching students to think critically rather than to defer automatically to authority, the responsibility that comes with being in a position of influence over the education and development of future professionals. All of these themes were relevant not just to legal education, but to education and professional development in every field. The Harvard confrontation also became a moment that crystallized broader debates about the relationship between academia and public service, between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Dershowitz had tried to dismiss Crockett's critique by suggesting that her background in trial law rather than academic scholarship meant she did not understand the nuances of legal writing for a general audience. but this attempt to claim a higher ground of expertise backfired because Crockett's practical experience actually gave her a sharper eye for the kinds of errors that would matter in real-world practice. She knew how lawyers use sources because she had been a lawyer. She knew how judges evaluated arguments because she had made those arguments in court. Her critique was not coming from someone lost in ivory tower abstractions, but from someone who understood both the theory and the practice of law. Looking back on that November evening at Harvard Law School, it was clear that what had happened was more than just one person correcting another person's errors. It was a moment of institutional reckoning, a reminder that even the most prestigious institutions and the most celebrated individuals must be held to standards of accuracy and integrity. It was a demonstration of what courage and preparation can accomplish when someone is willing to stand up for what is right even in the face of power and institutional pressure. It was a teaching moment for law students about the importance of critical thinking and intellectual independence, and it was a reminder to everyone, in every profession and every walk of life, that accountability matters, that truth matters, and that sometimes it takes someone with the courage to speak up to ensure that those things are not forgotten or compromised. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the importance of accountability and speaking truth to power, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories about the people who are standing up, asking tough questions, and demanding better from our institutions and leaders. Share this video with anyone who needs to see that challenging authority with facts and evidence can make a real difference. And leave a comment telling us what you think about how we hold powerful people accountable in academia, in politics, and in every area of public life. The conversation that started in that Harvard auditorium needs to continue, and your voice is part of that conversation. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, where we'll continue to explore the moments that are shaping how America thinks about truth, power, and accountability.